All right. Well, Marissa, thank you so much for joining me today to have a conversation about your career journey and especially what you've done to, explore and be successful in different positions. But I'd love to start with you introducing yourself with your name and when you graduated and what you're doing now.
Of course. So my name's Marissa Brock. I am a 2023 graduate from Trachtenberg School. I'm currently the Senior Director of Policy and Government Affairs at SourceMap, which is a tech company. We do supply chain mapping to identify risks in the upstream supply chain. So that can include social risks like human rights, forced labor, child labor, or environmental risks such as deforestation, calculating scope 3 emissions, et cetera. So while this is a tech company, there is a really distinct policy and government affairs focus, since the primary use case for our software is a regulatory use case. So a really, really interesting, kind of unique and somewhat niche job.
Excellent. All right, I'm going to get right into it and start with our first question, which is, what is the best networking advice you've received?
Yeah, I love answering this question because I think in the past, at least when I was an undergrad, I used to be a little self-conscious about networking. I think I still have a little bit of that, but I've luckily lost a lot of it, that feeling of self-consciousness, of kind of being able to advocate for myself. Honestly, the best networking advice that I ever received was don't be afraid to advocate for yourself. And frankly, people want to help you generally. I sort of needed to be taught that because I oftentimes assumed, especially when I was younger, that um, you know, reaching out to folks who perhaps I'd worked with years prior, or maybe developed some relationship with in school, or had as a professor, and then years later they came back around, and perhaps there was a job opportunity, a career growth opportunity. Um, I would feel self-conscious asking for their help, and learned pretty quickly that one, people generally do like to help, but also to be clear and specific about what you are asking for. Don't just reach out. I'm starting to get these now, which has shown how far out of school I am at this point, at least how far out of undergrad I am. But when you just get a LinkedIn message that doesn't have a really specific ask attached, it's kind of hard to help that person when you don't really know what they're asking for. Um, but it really was helpful career advice for me, to not be afraid to advocate for myself, and to also just believe that I deserve to be in the spaces that I am, that I work in, and that I occupy, um, and um, and lean on some of the relationships that I've developed over the years. I think that's the best part of networking, when you're able to perhaps work again with a colleague that you really enjoyed working with years prior. The job that I have now is actually the result of networking with a colleague that I had worked with all the way back in 2015.
Wow.
That was sort of the foot in the door to my current role. So don't be afraid to do that.
Excellent advice all the way around. And I especially liked how you talked about, feeling like you deserve to be in those conversations and in those spaces. I think sometimes that transition from undergrad and student into fellow professional, regardless of how long you've spent in the field, can be a challenging one. So that's great
Absolutely.
advice. Okay. What specific action do you think you've taken that significantly impacted any of your job searches?
Interesting question. I think that this is a little bit of a general piece of advice, but I've gotten pickier as I've gotten older. I know what I'm good at, and I know sort of what I bring to the table. And honestly, my graduate degree added a lot of confidence for me around the specific skills that I know I bring to my current job. And as I've sort of looked for jobs, when I was looking at opportunities in school and in years past, and looking forward, I really am able to kind of narrow down not just what I know I'm good at, but also what, brings me joy in a career. What are the sort of specific green flags and red flags, frankly, that you might identify in a job description? I think I've gotten better at reading between the lines and also asking those questions in an interview and throughout an interview process. That's really evolved over the now 10 years since I've been out of undergrad. Um, in a way that I think has really served me as I've looked for roles. And also something that I think sort of comes with a little bit of a little bit of age and wisdom is, many people have been deterred by a job description that might say, the first line is they're asking for a certain number of years of experience. And once you've been in the workplace for a little while, you start to realize that is a desired range. If you have 7 years of experience and the job is asking for 10, you should still apply. I think that is something that when I was 23, I would look at that and say, oh, I'm disqualified. I can't apply for that job. And that absolutely would not be a deterrent for me now. So, just I've definitely learned to be a little bit more picky. And sometimes that means you're applying to something you identify that it's not the right fit for yourself. Withdraw from consideration. I mean, that's not something that I've luckily had to do frequently, but there have definitely been one or two times where I've come up through an interview process and seen some red flags where I've said, this is actually not right for me. And that's definitely something that has changed over the years. I don't know that I would have been withdrawing from roles in my early 20s because of not the right culture fit or something that was maybe a red flag for me.
And you mentioned in the previous answer about deserving to be in the spaces, and it sounds like a little bit of a theme here is also recognizing that you deserve to have preferences and
Yeah,
you deserve to like certain things and maybe not want to do certain things, and exploring that is important also.
yeah, absolutely.
You mentioned interviews briefly in that answer, which leads me to my next question. What have you found most helpful when you've prepared for interviews? It's not easy.
Yeah, so I tend to over prepare. I think that there's a degree where you can overthink a little bit when you're trying to learn every possible thing that you can about a company. There is at a certain point you do reach a point of diminishing returns where, if I'm prepping for an interview, it shouldn't be something where I feel like I need to prep for 7 consecutive days for hours at a time. But I definitely come in knowing as much as I need to know about the company, about the role, and specifically about the role, understanding when I'm interviewing, how am I tying back my previous work experience to the specific skills that are identified in the job description, and sort of weaving that as a narrative. I feel very lucky in this, but I have had a career where I've taken jobs in different fields in the public sector, private sector, nonprofit, and I think that makes my resume and my career experience very exciting. But it also means I do have to weave a narrative of why did I do this? Why did I, in my first job out of school, start in the private sector, and then after a year, transition to the nonprofit world and stay there for several years. And then in the last few years, I went back to the private sector, but on the government affairs side. So, being able to really tell that narrative in a way that shows there was a vision behind this. There was a sort of a path and a trajectory and a goal behind this. And also, here are the skills that I've gained along the way that really do specifically tie back to what you're looking for in this job that I'm interviewing for. I think that's really how I try to prepare. And as you can probably tell from even how I'm talking now, I do not like to script. I think that you sound scripted. I can always tell when someone is reading when I'm talking to them, or when they've really kind of clearly bulleted out, this is exactly what I want to say, and they're reading it verbatim. So what I try to do is prepare where I'm kind of thinking about themes, but I'm not scripting in any way because I think that that's fairly easy to read. And so I might have my notes in front of me. I'm able to kind of draw things back to those themes but in a way that's coming across as natural and not as if I'm, reading off of a piece of paper.
It's interesting that you say that. So many interviews now are virtual. And I think that if you get used to reading off of your screen, it's going to be
Yeah,
tough if and when, and maybe it's an if, but if and when
yeah.
you're back in a room with people and you're interviewing with them, that's a skill you probably don't want to lose.
Definitely. I mean, I think that the transition, well, of course, we had to do this as a result of the pandemic. Having interviews fully remote is definitely a challenge. I prefer being in person in terms of interviewing because it's easier to read people's body language. It's easier, I think, for you as a candidate to come across as personable when you're actually in front of a human being. So that's definitely something that I had to adjust in interviews that I've participated in, and any sort of job opportunities that I've participated in since the onset of the pandemic. But frankly, that's why I think it's all the more important to make sure that you're not coming across as scripted, because as you said, it's easy to fall into that habit when you're doing a Zoom interview or a remote interview. And that can be a habit that's hard to break once you've established it.
Yeah,
And as I've said, I think it's kind of easy to tell when when that's what's happening.
absolutely. So I'm wondering, do you bring up in your interview or when you're talking with potential employers your capstone project? Everybody pretty much is doing a capstone project. And, where does that maybe fit in this process of looking for positions?
Yeah, so I really do love bringing up my capstone project because it's something that I'm really proud of, and I feel very lucky that I really enjoyed the client that we worked with. My group worked with the National Black Justice Coalition. What I find really interesting about talking about my capstone is in the current role that I have, the work that we were doing as part of that capstone project is fairly irrelevant to my current job. There's not a lot of overlap in the specific research we were doing and sort of the end deliverable of the project. But what, of course, is relevant are the skills that we gained as a group working with a client and having to meet these specific deliverables, these deadlines, and do a lot of research for that client and on behalf of that client. That is directly transferable in the job that I have now. I have a fairly front-facing role where I'm interacting with not just the customers of the company that I work for, but also folks in government and in the public sector in the US and in Europe. So there is overlap there in terms of understanding how to work professionally with a client, meet those deadlines, and also just demonstrating that I have experience working with a small team on a fairly complex research project. I think that is transferable to almost any role. And so, I think that my advice to students who are struggling to sort of contextualize their capstone project, especially if they feel like the job they're interviewing for doesn't have that much overlap, is really about the skills you gained from completing your capstone should be sort of the focus when you're talking about it. And the last thing I'll say is whenever I'm interviewing someone, whenever I'm on the other side and I'm interviewing a candidate for a role, at my company, I love to hear about projects that they worked on that they were really passionate about. I think that is a invaluable part of the capstone experience. If you were lucky enough to be on a project where you really loved working with that client and you really enjoyed that project, you're just going to talk about it in a way that I think is attractive to whoever's interviewing you. I think that that's something that would make them want to hire you. They see that you're really passionate about this project. And even if you had this short amount of time with this client, you really were committed to delivering. So that's really how I like to talk about my capstone.
That's great. And I think sometimes when I see students' resumes and it just lists the degree, I say, pretty sure there's some other stuff that you've done that's exciting that an employer would want to know about. And of course, once we start talking, there's plenty that comes out, but not forgetting the importance and the relevance, even if it's not the same matching subject matter, the skills are absolutely relevant, transferable, and important. And yeah, you get excited when you talk about these things. So you still look
Absolutely.
excited, and it's, didn't just happen yesterday. So okay, last question for you. What either specific action or kind of strategy would you say has been most impactful on your general career advancement? You did talk a lot about having different types of positions, but maybe there's a theme that you've kind of stood by as you've moved forward.
Yeah, honestly, what my advice there would just to be creative. I think the reason that my resume is well, I would argue is so interesting because I've had sort of very different roles is being able to identify what it is that I really enjoy about just working in general. What are the specific things that I love doing? I love research. I love working on projects that are long-term projects that might have some mission-driven goals. So I've worked for mission-driven companies in the public sector and the private sector. That's not something that's confined to you have to work for a nonprofit to have a mission-driven position. And how do I sort of bring those things that I really like about just working in general into the roles that I'm applying for and the roles that I'm pursuing? And I think that's just allowed me to sort of get creative. I don't feel like I've ever felt really confined to a specific industry, even. And particularly when you're thinking about government affairs and a policy focused role, those exist in a lot of industries that you perhaps would not expect. I mean, the role that I have now, I think, is an example of that this is a tech company. This is a private sector company. It's a startup. I mean, it's been around for a fairly long time now, but it's still technically a startup. And this is a decidedly policy and government affairs role. I get to work with lobbyists. I get to meet with folks in DC, and because we're an international company, meet with folks in Brussels and really closely follow laws coming out of the European Union. And that's something that I maybe wouldn't have dreamt of 10 years ago, that this type of job would exist in this specific industry. And so that's what I mean when I say, be creative. Um, it is sometimes difficult to envision just the scope of opportunities that might exist when you do kind of broaden your search horizons, frankly, when you really try to think a little bit more creatively about what types of roles um, might be a good fit for you.
That's great advice. And I love the fact that you don't have to only go to the nonprofit sector to have a mission-driven position. That's a great message for our students to hear. Marissa, I cannot thank you enough for your time and your fabulous advice. I know our students will absolutely love hearing what you've had to say, and we are grateful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.